So my studies have always included very ethnically and racially diverse samples. So my studies include Black and Puerto Rican and Dominican and Chinese American and white European, Eastern European, etc. I have all sorts of boys represented across social class. And the interesting thing are two things. One is that there's a remarkable similarity across all these boys because they're all raised in the same American culture. And so the loss that I talk about so much, you hear that across social class, across race, across ethnicity. The difference is interestingly enough, you hear that boys raised in communities where relationships and emotional acuity is more valued, for example, in a lot of Latino communities, where that is really a core part of what it means to be a Puerto Rican young man, for example, is being emotionally astute and connected to their community. Of the boys who are able to maintain their friendships and continue to have positive, emotionally intimate friendships, it's oftentimes the boys coming from such communities. And so of course there's variability in the loss. Not all boys lose their friendships, not all boys struggle to hold on to their friendships. There's always variability in any kind of sample. But the variability we see really seems to correspond with the young men who come from communities in which they really are valuing community more than some other boys. And particularly in my samples, you hear that from the Puerto Rican boys in particular. A lot of my studies are done in New York, Boston, the East Coast, where the Puerto Rican communities are very tight-knit, and so that you really hear this strong sort of ability to hold on to the relationships through adolescence. But you still hear the loss too. So interesting enough, so you have lots of examples of boys hanging out that's not necessarily healthy hanging out. And so one of the things I try to make very clear based on what the boys have told me directly is when I say boys need friendships, I don't mean any friendships. I don't mean they just need anybody to hang out with. I mean that they need healthy relationships. They need mutually supportive relationships. And according to the boys, that means being able to be vulnerable with each other, being able to share secrets with each other, not being laughed at when you feel vulnerable. And all those kinds of things are not actually typical of many boy groups. So gangs, for example, oftentimes people say, well, young men join gangs because they're looking for family. Well, that's oftentimes the case. But the kind of support they're getting oftentimes in particularly violent gangs is not the kind of support that boys are talking about wanting. They are really explicitly talking about wanting to be able to be vulnerable with another young man, be cared for in that way, in ways that allows them to feel very close. And I think it's important in our culture when we sort of talk about, you know, bromance or all sorts of ways we say, oh, boys don't have any problems with that. There's gangs, there's fraternities, there's all sorts of male groups coming together. But for the most part, when you talk to young men in those contexts, they are not having the relationships they want. They tell you that explicitly. They're not finding the close friendships that they want. And if they are, it's oftentimes, right, some kind of context. It's not in where they're engaged in negative behavior. It's some kind of fraternity or sports team where the coach, for example, is really fostering the relationships among the team players. In a fraternity or in any kind of boys' activities where boys are together, if the leader or the coach or the faith leader is encouraging relationships, then you see boys really finding the friendships that they want. So a lot of it is really, you know, making clear that we're not just talking about anybody, but, you know, boys hanging out with anybody. We're really talking about boys finding the relationships that they most want and that they tell us that they most want. So the interesting thing about teen parents is what we learned from listening to teen mothers as well as teen fathers, and I did a book on teen mothers a long time ago where we followed them over 6 years, is that parents, teenagers, in their looking for connection, oftentimes see having children as a possibility of, you know, having the kind of connection they're seeking. So you hear lots of young men, women and men talk about the desire for connection, the desire to have a child, to really connect. Young men will talk about wanting to have a child to be the father that their father never was, wanting to have that kind of connection with another human being, a son or a daughter. I mean, it really is, if you understand teen parenting within the framework of young people really looking for connection, deep connection, that you understand more why they might choose to have a child with the hopes that they can have the kind of relationship with their children that they're perhaps not having in their schools or with their peers or at home, etc. So I think it's a critical issue to think about what are the strategies that young people use to seek that connection. And if they're not properly guided by a loving adult, a loving peer, a loving leader in the community, oftentimes they make choices to find connection in not so great places. So they'll choose to have a baby when they're 15 or 16, when in fact if they were surrounded by a loving community, would provide them opportunities for connection that didn't entail having a baby at 15 or 16, and the same is true for teenage fathers too. And so when you find them, when you offer them the guidance, the scaffolding, so to speak, in terms of making choices of how to find good connections, then you see that young people make good choices. But we have to offer them the opportunities. We have to offer them the possibilities to find these connections. The good news that we know from early adolescence that boys have remarkable emotional acuity, that they are able to express what they want, what they need to thrive. And so I think, we take that good news that boys actually, we don't have to teach it to them. We don't have to, give them a curriculum on it, that they naturally have it. You see that in the work with young boys too, in Judy Chu's work. You see that at 4- and 5-year-old boys also have that remarkable emotional acuity and astuteness. And so our challenge then is not to have to teach it to boys, but to actually nurture it. And that's a much easier task, to try to nourish it than to try to teach something that's fundamentally human. So the good news in some ways, a lot of people say that my research is depressing because it talks about the loss. But I always think, no, it's the opposite. It's incredibly hopeful, because what it shows is that boys have the capacity, the interest, the ability to talk about what they want and need the most. And we need to listen to them carefully and nurture that capacity. And that's easy to do. It's easy to do. So the good news is that boys already have what they need to thrive, and now it's up to us to actually nurture it. So what I say to all healthcare professionals, social workers, community leaders, all people who work with youth, I say the same thing. We have to begin to challenge our obsessive focus on the individual as understanding someone's problems. So as long as we treat them as if what's going wrong in their life is simply a matter of them making bad choices, we don't really get at the root of the problem. We need to see them as part of a community, part of a set of relationships, and thus treat them in that way. So when we understand that a young person is, for example, engaging in risky behavior, taking drugs, using alcohol, engaging in violence, etc., we need to see them as not a separate individual and sort of understand why they're making bad choices. They certainly are making bad choices, but to understand, as the boys always tell me, why are they making bad choices? And almost always it goes back to the same story, which is that they're trying to seek out connection. They're trying to feel connected to themselves and others, and when they're not being provided the scaffolding to be able to do that in a healthy fashion, they make bad choices. So yes, they are making bad choices, but we need to see them as, how do we help them find the relational needs they want? How do we help build their own communities so that they're stronger and more connected, so they won't make bad choices, rather than lecturing them, which parents often do, but professionals sometimes do as well, lecturing our children and our clients that they're just simply making bad choices. We need to start helping them find solutions through building community. So what I would want to do is have the medical professional basically engage with the young person about how they're doing, not just how they're doing in terms of whether they're doing well in school, or I'm thinking about all the questions that pediatricians oftentimes ask their adolescent clients or patients, is that really finding out how their friendships are, whether they're having the friendships that they want, having a list of resources of kinds of activities, kinds of after-school activities that young people could do, figuring out ways to help young people find the relationships that they want, but really checking in with young people around those topics. So you're communicating, when you check in as a pediatrician or as a social worker, you're communicating to the other person, to the person you're meeting with, that the relationships matter and that you care about the relationships. friendships. So ask them. Ask them about how are things going at home in your school with your friends. How are things going on at home with your relationships with your mom and your dad or whomever the child is living with. And really making it clear that that's as important as asking if you smoke or not, or if you engage in alcohol, or all the kinds of questions that young people are always asked when they enter into a healthcare facility. But really focusing on the relationships, and then thinking about when the child says, I don't have the friendships I want, I feel kind of lonely, sometimes it makes me sad, which a lot of young people tell me in our interviews. Having resources to sort of think about how to connect them to different organizations, to different groups, sometimes religiously based, sometimes sports based, depending on what the interest of the child is. And so really communicating again through your conversation with them that this is valuable. So for parents, I think, first of all, we have to start young. We have to start when our children are babies, in terms of the way we communicate to them, the way we show them what we value. So that means helping them have, when they're younger, helping them have good friendships, good peer relationships. When they get bullied, when they're perhaps bullying other children, we take that seriously. We talk about it not as in a defensive mode if our children happen to be the bullies, but actually in a way of thinking about, why is my child feeling like it's necessary to bully another child? You know, what can I do to help him feel more connected so he doesn't feel like he has to bully someone to be liked by other kids? Oftentimes kids will tell me directly they bully because they're hoping that that will make them popular. And so the idea is, but root is, right, their desire for connection. They want to be connected to other kids, and they're using the wrong strategies to try to do that. So it's really having discussions about these things at the dinner table, in the car when you're driving home with your child, at nighttime if you put them to bed, starting from a very early age. And I even, as a parent, I have a parent of a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old, I even talk about my own friendships with my children, not the inner details, but I talk about the conflicts I have with my friends so that they understand that friendships also take work. There can be conflict. This is how you can work through a conflict. I mean, really not only helping our children have friendships, but maintain those friendships. What does it mean when your friend does something really mean to you? How should you handle that? What should you say? And really having spaces in your home that your children can talk about that. And if they don't want to talk about it with you, which a lot of teenagers don't want to talk to their parents about that, then figuring out ways that they can bring their friends over to be able to talk about it. Inviting the young people over to spend the night at your house, or allowing them to go spend the night at somebody else's house. Or when you go on a family trip, allowing one of the friends of your children to come along with you, even though many parents don't want that because they feel like it takes away from their time with their children. But invest in that relationship. Figure out opportunities that you can do with the child so that their friendships are really nourished. And so if you start that at a very young age, then it becomes much easier in adolescence, when it can be a tougher time in terms of communication, that your sons and daughters will make good choices. Because ultimately, as parents, I've decided, after being a parent of teenagers now, and all my research, that it's really about helping our children make good choices. And how do we help them make good choices? By actually allowing them their full humanity to flourish, their full, emotional capacity to flourish, and that allows them to make better choices than children who are restricted to not feeling, not crying, not expressing things that are more sensitive and vulnerable. That really shuts down their humanity.